Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard ISO 22000-2018 Food Safety Management Systems. In this session, we shall cover all the requirements of ISO 22000-2018 Food Safety Management Systems in detail. Let's discuss about the outcome of this session. Before discussing the standard, let me give you a brief idea about International Organization for Standardization, or ISO in short. ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, is a worldwide federation of national standards bodies, ISO member bodies. The work of preparing international standards is normally carried out through ISO technical committees. Each member body interested in a subject for whom a technical committee has been established has the right to be represented on that committee. International organizations, governmental and non-governmental, in liaison with ISO, also take part in the work. ISO collaborates closely with the International Electrotechnical Commission, IEC, on all matters of electrotechnical standardization. This document was prepared by Technical Committee, ISO TC 34. Food Products Subcommittee SC 17, Management Systems for Food Safety. This second edition cancels and replaces the first edition, ISO 22000-2005, which has been technically revised through the adoption of a revised clause sequence. It also incorporates the technical corrigendum ISO 22000-2005, Corrigendum 1, 2006. Let's have a general introduction of the standard. According to the standard ISO 22000-2018, the adoption of a food safety management system, or FSMS in short, is a strategic decision for an organization that can help to improve its overall performance in food safety. The likely benefits to an organization of implementing an FSMS based on this standard are like: Benefit 1 is the ability to consistently provide safe foods and products and services that meet customers and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Benefit 2, it is addressing risks associated with its objectives. And benefit 3 is the ability to demonstrate conformity to specified FSMS requirements. This standard ISO 22000-2018 employs the process approach, which incorporates the Plan, Do, Check, Act PDCA cycle and risk-based thinking. We will discuss all these aspects in this session. In short, this process approach enables an organization to plan its processes and their interactions. The PDCA cycle enables an organization to ensure that its processes are adequately resourced and managed, and those opportunities for improvement are determined and acted upon. And the risk-based thinking enables an organization to determine the factors that could cause its processes and its FSMS to deviate from the planned results, and to put in place controls to prevent or minimize adverse effects. Let's understand the FSMS principles. As per the ISO 22000-2018, the food safety is related to the presence of food safety hazards at the time of consumption, which is like intaking by the consumer. If we talk about the food chain business, food safety hazards can occur at any stage of the food chain. Therefore, adequate control throughout the food chain is vital. Food safety is ensured through the combined efforts of all the parties in the food chain, including the raw material suppliers and kitchen staff members, etc. This standard ISO 22000-2018 specifies the requirements for an FSMS that combines some commonly recognized key elements. Those key elements are interactive communication, system management, prerequisite programs, and hazard analysis and critical control point HACCP principles. In addition to these key elements, This standard is based on the principles that are common to ISO management system standards. The management principles are customer focus, leadership, engagement of people, process approach, improvement, evidence-based decision making, and relationship management. Let us talk now about the process approach. The ISO 22000 adopts a process approach when developing and implementing an FSMS and improving its effectiveness to enhance production of safe products and services while meeting applicable requirements. Understanding and managing interconnected processes as a system contributes to the organization's effectiveness and efficiency in achieving its intended results. The standard specifies that the process approach involves the systematic definition and management of processes and their interactions so as to achieve the intended results in accordance with the food and safety policy and strategic direction of the organization. Management of the processes and the system as a whole can be achieved using the PDCA cycle with an overall focus on risk-based thinking aimed at taking advantage of opportunities and preventing undesirable results. Standard states that the recognition of the organization's role and position within the food chain is important to ensure effective interactive communication throughout the food chain. Let me explain the Plan, Do, Check, Act or PDCA cycle. We can describe the PDCA cycle briefly. Plan is basically to establish the objectives of the system and its processes by providing the resources needed to deliver the results. This also includes identifying and addressing risks and opportunities for organization. Do means simply implementing what was planned by the organization. Check is monitoring and measuring processes and the resulting products and services, analyzing and evaluating information and data from monitoring, measuring and verification activities, and finally reporting the results. Act is basically taking actions to improve performance as necessary. In this document and as illustrated in Figure 1, the process approach uses the concept of the PDCA cycle at two levels. The first covers the overall frame of the FSMS, Clause 4 to Clause 7 and Clause 9 to Clause 10. The other level, operational planning and control, covers the operational processes within the food safety system as described in Clause 8. Communication between the two levels is therefore essential. Friends, till now it was about PDCA cycle and now coming to the risk-based thinking. As per this standard, risk-based thinking is essential for achieving an effective FSMS. In ISO 22000, risk-based thinking is addressed on two levels, organizational and operational, which is consistent with the process approach that I have already described. Coming to organizational risk management, ISO 22000 states that risk is the effect of uncertainty. Those uncertainties can have positive or negative effects on an organization. In the context of organizational risk management, a positive deviation arising from a risk can also provide an opportunity to an organization. But what is important here is to consider that not all positive effects of risk result in opportunities. Standard specifies that to conform to the requirements of the standard, an organization plans and implements actions to address organizational risks, which are covered in Clause 6 of ISO 22000. Addressing risks creates a foundation for increasing the effectiveness of the FSMS, achieving improved results and preventing negative effects. Let us talk about the hazard analysis, operational processes. The concept of risk-based thinking based on the HACCP principles at the operational level is implicit in this standard. The subsequent steps in hazard analysis and critical control point or HACCP principles can be considered as the necessary measures to prevent hazards or reduce hazards to acceptable levels to ensure food is safe at the time of consumption. Standard says that decisions taken in the application of HACCP should be based on science, free from bias and documented. The documentation should include any key assumptions in the decision-making process. Now, coming to the relationship of ISO 22000-2018 FSMS with other management system standards. This document has been developed within the ISO high-level structure. The objective of the high-level structure, HLS, is to improve alignment between ISO management system standards. This standard enables an organization to use the process approach, coupled with the PDCA cycle and risk-based thinking, to align or integrate its FSMS approach with the requirements of other management systems and supporting standards. This document is the core principle and framework for FSMSs and sets out the specific FSMS requirements for organizations throughout the food chain. Other guidance related to food safety, specifications, and/or requirements specific to food sectors can be used together with this framework. In addition, ISO has developed a family of associated documents. These include documents for prerequisite programs for specific sectors of the food chain, requirements for auditing and AMP, certification bodies, and traceability. ISO also provides guidance documents for organizations on how to implement this and related standards. For more information, you are suggested to refer the ISO website. Friends, this was basic information about the standard. Now let me start with the requirements of ISO 22000-2018 Food Safety Management Systems. In this session, we shall cover the 10 sections of the standard. These clauses are scope, normative references, terms and definitions, context of the organization, leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. So friends, let's start with the scope of ISO 22000-2018 Food Safety Management Systems. Under the scope, the standard specifies requirements for a food safety management system, FSMS, to enable an organization that is directly or indirectly involved in the food chain. A. To plan, implement, operate, maintain, and update an FSMS providing products and services that are safe in accordance with their intended use. To demonstrate compliance with applicable statutory and regulatory food safety requirements. To evaluate and assess mutually agreed customer food safety requirements and to demonstrate conformity with them. To effectively communicate food safety issues to interested parties within the food chain. To ensure that the organization conforms to its stated food safety policy. To demonstrate conformity to relevant interested parties. And to seek certification or registration of its FSMS by an external organization or make a self-assessment or self-declaration of conformity to this document. As per scope of ISO 22000-2018, all requirements of this standard are generic and are intended to be applicable to all organizations in the food chain, regardless of their size and complexity. Organizations that are directly or indirectly involved include, but are not limited to, feed producers, animal food producers, harvesters of wild plants and animals, farmers, producers of ingredients, food manufacturers, retailers, and organizations providing food services, catering services, cleaning and sanitization services, transportation, storage, and distribution services, suppliers of equipment, cleaning and disinfectants, packaging materials, and other food contact materials. Scope defines that this standard ISO 22000-2018 allows any organization, including small or less developed organizations like a small farm, a small packer distributor, a small retail or food service outlet, etc., to implement externally developed elements in their FSMS. Scope states that internal and external resources can be used to meet the requirements of ISO 22000-2018. Friends, till now it was about the scope of ISO 22000-2080, Food Safety Management Systems. Now let us come to the normative references. As per the standard document, there are no normative references in this standard. Let us come to the third clause of the ISO 22000-2018, that is, terms and definitions. Before explaining the terms and definitions applicable for the purposes of this standard, let me tell you, ISO and IEC maintain terminological databases for use in standardization, the URLs of which can be seen here on the screen. You are recommended to visit these websites for more information about the terms and definitions used in various standards. Now, let me start with the terms and definitions. Acceptable level. Acceptable level is a level of food safety hazard not to be exceeded in the end product provided by the organization. Action criterion. This is measurable or observable specification for the monitoring of an operational prerequisite program or OPRP. An action criterion is established to determine whether an OPRP remains in control and distinguishes between what is acceptable and unacceptable. Audit. Audit is systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining audit evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which the audit criteria are fulfilled. An audit can be an internal audit, first party, or an external audit, second party, or third party, and it can be a combined audit combining two or more disciplines. An internal audit is conducted by the organization itself or by an external party on its behalf. Audit evidence and audit criteria are defined in ISO 19011. Relevant disciplines are, for example, food safety management, quality management, or environmental management. Competence. It is an ability to apply knowledge and skills to achieve intended results. Conformity. Conformity is fulfillment of a requirement. Contamination. Contamination is introduction or occurrence of a contaminant, including a food safety hazard, in a product or processing environment. Continual improvement. Continual improvement is a recurring activity to enhance performance. Control measure. Control measure is an action or activity that is essential to prevent a significant food safety hazard or reduce it to an acceptable level. Control measures are identified by hazard analysis. Correction. Correction is an action to eliminate a detected non-conformity. A correction includes the handling of potentially unsafe products and can therefore be made in conjunction with a corrective action. A correction may be, for example, reprocessing, further processing, and/or elimination of the adverse consequences of the non-conformity, such as disposal for other use or specific labeling. Corrective action. Corrective action is an action to eliminate the cause of non-conformity and to prevent recurrence. There can be more than one cause for non-conformity, and corrective action includes cause analysis. Critical Control Point or CCP. This is a step in the process at which control measures are applied to prevent or reduce a significant food safety hazard to an acceptable level, and defined critical limits and measurement enable the application of correction. Critical limit. Critical limit is a measurable value which separates acceptability from unacceptability. Critical limits are established to determine whether a CCP remains in control. If a critical limit is exceeded or not met, the products affected are to be handled as potentially unsafe products. Documented information information required to be controlled and maintained by an organization, and the medium on which it is contained. Documented information can be in any format and media and from any source. Documented information can refer to the management system, including related processes, information created in order for the organization to operate, evidence of results achieved. Effectiveness. Effectiveness is an extent to which planned activities are realized and planned results achieved. End product. End product is a product that will undergo no further processing or transformation by the organization. A product that undergoes further processing or transformation by another organization is an end product in the context of the first organization, and a raw material or an ingredient in the context of the second organization. Feed. Feed is basically single or multiple products, whether processed, semi-processed or raw, which is intended to be fed to the food-producing animals. Distinctions are made in this standard between the terms food, feed, and animal food. Food is intended for consumption by humans and animals and includes feed and animal food. Feed is intended to be fed to food-producing animals. Animal food is intended to be fed to non-food-producing animals, such as pets. Flow diagram. Flow diagram is schematic and systematic presentation of the sequence and interactions of steps in the process. Food. Food is a substance or ingredient, whether processed, semi-processed or raw, which is intended for consumption, which can include drinks, chewing gum, and any substance which has been used in the manufacture, preparation, or treatment of food, but does not include cosmetics or tobacco or substances or ingredients used only as drugs. Animal food. Animal food is single or multiple products, whether processed, semi-processed, or raw, which is intended to be fed to non-food producing animals. Food chain. Food chain is a sequence of the stages in the production, processing, distribution, storage, and handling of a food and its ingredients, from primary production to the consumption. This includes the production of feed and animal food. The food chain also includes the production of materials intended to come into contact with food or raw materials. The food chain also includes service providers. Food safety. Food safety is an assurance that food will not cause an adverse health effect for the consumer when it is prepared and or consumed in accordance with its intended use. Food safety is related to the occurrence of food safety hazards in end products and does not include other health aspects related to, for example, malnutrition. Food safety hazard. Food safety hazard is biological, chemical, or physical agent in food with the potential to cause an adverse health effect. The term hazard is not to be confused with the term risk, which in the context of food safety means a function of the probability of an adverse health effect, example, becoming diseased, and the severity of that effect, example, death, hospitalization, when exposed to a specified hazard. Food safety hazards include allergens and radiological substances. Interested party, preferred term, or stakeholder, admitted term. Interested party is a person or organization that can be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or an activity. Lot. Lot is a defined quantity of a product produced and or processed and or packaged essentially under the same conditions. The lot is determined by parameters established beforehand by the organization and may be described by other terms. Example, batch. The lot may be reduced to a single unit of product. Management system. Management system is a set of interrelated or interacting elements of an organization to establish policies and objectives and processes to achieve those objectives. A management system can address a single discipline or several disciplines. The system elements include the organization's structure, roles and responsibilities, planning and operation. The scope of a management system may include the whole of the organization, specific and identified functions of the organization, specific and identified sections of the organization, or one or more functions across a group of organizations. Relevant disciplines are, for example, a quality management system or an environmental management system. Measurement. Measurement is a process to determine a value. Monitoring. Monitoring is determining the status of a system, a process, or an activity. To determine the status, there may be a need to check, supervise, or critically observe. In the context of food safety, monitoring is conducting a planned sequence of observations or measurements to assess whether a process is operating as intended. Distinctions are made in this standard between the terms validation, monitoring, and verification. Validation is applied prior to an activity and provides information about the capability to deliver intended results. Monitoring is applied during an activity and provides information for action within a specified time frame. Verification is applied after an activity and provides information for confirmation of conformity. Non-conformity. Non-conformity is non-fulfillment of a requirement. Objective. Objective is the result to be achieved. An objective can be strategic, tactical, or operational. Objectives can relate to different disciplines such as financial, health and safety, and environmental goals, and can apply at different levels such as strategic, organization-wide, project, product, and process. An objective can be expressed in other ways. Example, as an intended outcome, a purpose, an operational criterion, as an FSMS objective, or by the use of other words with similar meaning. Example, aim, goal, or target. In the context of FSMS, objectives are set by the organization consistent with the food safety policy to achieve specific results. Operational Prerequisite Program, OPRP. OPRP is control measure or combination of control measures applied to prevent or reduce a significant food safety hazard to an acceptable level, and where action criterion and measurement or observation enable effect, control. Organization. Organization is a person or group of people that has its own functions with responsibilities, authorities, and relationships to achieve its objectives. The concept of organization includes, but is not limited to sole trader, company, corporation, firm, enterprise, authority, partnership, charity, or institution, or part of combination thereof, whether incorporated or not, public or private. Outsource. Outsource is making an arrangement where an external organization performs part of an organization's function or process. An external organization is outside the scope of the management system, although the outsourced function or process is within the scope. Performance. Performance is a measurable result. Performance can relate either to quantitative or qualitative findings. Performance can relate to the management of activities, processes, products, including services, systems, or organizations. Policy. Policy is intentions and direction of an organization as formally expressed by its top management. Prerequisite Program or PRP. PRP is basic conditions and activities that are necessary within the organization and throughout the food chain to maintain food safety. The PRPs needed depend on the segment of the food chain in which the organization operates and the type of organization. Examples of equivalent terms are good agricultural practice, GAP, good veterinary practice, GVP, good manufacturing practice, GMP, good hygiene practice, GHP, good production practice, GPP, good distribution practice, GDP, and good trading practice, GTP. Process. Process is a set of interrelated or interacting activities which transforms inputs to outputs. Product. Product is an output that is a result of a process. A product can also be a service. Requirement. Requirement is a need or expectation that is stated, generally implied or obligatory. Generally implied means that it is custom or common practice for the organization and interested parties that the need or expectation under consideration is implied. A specified requirement is one that is stated, for example, in documented information. Risk. Risk is an effect of an uncertainty. An effect is a deviation from the expected, positive or negative. Uncertainty is the state, even partial or deficiency of information related to understanding or knowledge of an event, its consequence or likelihood. Risk is often characterized by reference to potential events as defined in ISO Guide 73, 2009, 3.5.1.3 and consequences as defined in ISO Guide 73, 2009, 3.6.1.3 or a combination of these. Risk is often expressed in terms of a combination of the consequences of an event, including changes in circumstances and the associated likelihood, as defined in ISO Guide 73, 2009, 3.6.1.1 of occurrence. Food safety risk is a function of the probability of an adverse health effect and the severity of that effect, consequential to hazards in food, as specified in the Codex Procedural Manual. Significant food safety hazard. Significant food safety hazard is food safety hazard identified through the hazard assessment, which needs to be controlled by control measures. Top management. Top management is a person or group of people who directs and controls an organization at the highest level. Top management has the power to delegate authority and provide resources within the organization. If the scope of the management system covers only part of an organization, then top management refers to those who direct and control that part of the organization. Traceability. Traceability is an ability to follow the history, application, movement, and location of an object through specified stages of production, processing, and distribution. Movement can relate to the origin of the materials, processing history or distribution of the food. An object can be a product, a material, a unit, an equipment, a service, etc. Update. Update is immediate and or planned activity to ensure application of the most recent information. Update is different from the terms maintain and retain. Maintain. Maintain is to keep something ongoing, to keep in good condition. Retain. It is to keep something that is retrievable. Validation. Validation is obtaining evidence that a control measure or combination of controlled measures will be capable of effectively controlling the significant food safety hazard. Validation is performed at the time a control measure combination is designed or whenever changes are made to the implemented controlled measures. Distinctions are made in this document between the terms validation, monitoring, and verification. Validation. Validation is applied prior to an activity and provides information about the capability to deliver intended results. Monitoring is applied during an activity and provides information for action within a specified time frame. Verification is applied after an activity and provides information for confirmation of conformity. Verification. Verification is confirmation through the provision of objective evidence that specified requirements have been fulfilled. Friends, we have discussed the Clause 3, Terms and Definitions of ISO 22000-2018. Now, we shall start the Clause 4, Context of the Organization. Clause 4 establishes the context of energy management system and underpins the rest of the standard. Organization will need to identify external and internal issues and the needs and expectations of its stakeholders and interested parties, as well as how value is delivered to them. This clause also partially addresses the concept of the creation of value. Here, the term issue covers not only problems or potential problems, but also important topics for the system to address, such as changing conditions, legal requirements, and other obligations. This Clause 4 of ISO 22000-2018 also includes determining the scope of the energy management system. The scope is intended to clarify the boundaries that apply the energy management system. Additionally, Clause 4 requires organization to establish, implement, maintain, and continually improve the management system in accordance with the requirements of the standard. Clause 4 of ISO 22000-2018 has 4 subclauses, which are 4.1 Understanding the organization and its context, 4.2 Understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties, 4.3 Determining the scope of the food safety management system, 4.4 Food safety management system. Let's start with subclause 4.1 Understanding the organization and its context. The subclause 4.1 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the organization is required to determine external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose and that affect its ability to achieve the intended results of its food safety management systems, FSMS. As per this subclause, the organization is required to identify, review, and update information related to these external and internal issues. Subclause guide under a note that issues can include positive and negative factors or conditions for consideration. Clause 4.1 further specifies that the understanding the context can be facilitated by considering external and internal issues, including but not limited to legal, technological, competitive, market, cultural, social, and economic environments, cybersecurity and food fraud, food defense and intentional contamination knowledge, and performance of the organization, whether international, national, regional, or local. Now, let us talk here about the external and internal issues. This requirement of Clause 4.1 can seem excessively general, and there is a threat of going too wide when defining the internal and external issues. In fulfilling this clause, organizations should emphasize only on issues that can affect the consumer satisfaction and delivery of quality product or service. An organization's internal context is the environment in which it targets to achieve its objectives. Internal context can include its approach to governance, its contractual relationships with customers, and its interested parties. Things that need to be considered are related to the culture, philosophies, ethics, or ideologies inside the organization, as well as complexity of processes and organizational structure. To determine external context, organization should consider issues arising from its social, technological, environmental, ethical, political, legal, and economic environment. Some examples of external context may include government regulations, changes in the laws, economic shifts in the market, the organization's competition, changes in technology, etc. We should include some of the internal context as well, but are not limited to Some of the examples of internal issues are structure of the organization, which has limited flexibility when dealing with varying demands. Availability of reliable, qualified, and competent workforce, which is very positive. Stability of workforce, where wage benchmarking is not consistent with competitors. Staff retention, which is also very high positive. Contractual arrangements with customers, which is beneficial to the organization. Payment terms from customers provides high credit. Solvency of customers and expansion of customer base also play an important role. The culture within the organization is equally important internal factor. Coming to Subclause 4.2, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. The Subclause 4.2 of ISO 22000 specifies that to ensure that the organization has the ability to consistently provide products and services that meet applicable statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements with regards to food safety, the organization is required to determine the interested parties that are relevant to the FSMS and also the relevant requirements of the interested parties of the FSMS. As per this Subclause 4.2, the organization is required to identify, review, and update information related to the interested parties and their requirements. The definition of interested parties is already explained under Clause 3 of the standard. Some of the examples of interested parties are customers, employees, governments, manufacturers, investors, shareholders, suppliers, vendors, etc. The Clause 4.2 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the organization must determine relevant interested parties and relevant requirements of appropriate concerned parties. Relevant interested parties to be considered are those that could affect or potentially affect the organization's ability to constantly provide products and services that meet customer and applicable statutory and regulatory requirements. Monitor and review information related to interested parties and relevant requirements. Initially, the organization will need to define external and internal issues that are relevant to its purpose, that is, what are the relevant issues, both inside and out, that have an influence on what the organization does. What would affect its capability to accomplish the intended outcomes of its management system. It should be noted that the term issue covers not only problems which would have been the subject of the precautionary action in previous standards, but also important topics for the management system to address, such as any market assurance and governance goals that the organization might set for its management system. Next, the organization has to determine relevant interested parties and relevant requirements of relevant interested parties. An interested party is a person or organization that can affect, be affected by, or recognize themselves to be affected by a decision or activity that's within the scope of the management system. There will be those external interested parties that enforce specific legal, regulatory, or contractual requirements in an organization. There may also be requirements specified by internal interested parties, for example, management and staff, which could be permanent and temporary. Let us talk about the Subclause 4.3, determining the scope of the food safety management system. The Subclause 4.3 of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that the organization is required to determine the boundaries and applicability of the FSMS to establish its scope. The scope must specify the products and services, processes, and production sites that are included in the FSMS. The scope must specify the products and services, processes, and production sites that are included in the FSMS. Clause says that the scope is required to include the activities, processes, products, or services that can have an influence on the food safety of its end products. Further, Subclause 4.3 states that when determining this scope, the organization is required to consider the external and internal issues referred to in Subclause 4.1 and the requirements referred to in Subclause 4.2 of the standard. Subclause 4.3 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the scope must be available and maintained as documented information to meet the requirements of the standard. Let me talk about the Subclause 4.4, Food Safety Management System. According to this clause, the organization is required to establish, implement, maintain, update, and continually improve an FSMS. The Food Safety Management System must include the processes needed and their interactions meeting the requirements of the standard. Friends, till now it was about the clause 4 of the standard. Now, let's talk about clause 5, leadership of ISO 22000-2018. This clause 5, leadership, talks about the role of top management, which is the group of people who direct and control an organization at the highest level. The top management need to ensure that the food safety management system and its requirements are integrated into the organization's processes and the policy and objectives are aligned with the strategic direction of the organization. Top management also needs to make sure that the food safety management policy is made available, communicated, maintained, and understood by all parties. The clause 5, leadership, is further divided into 3 sub-clauses, which are 5.1, leadership and commitment, 5.2, policy, 5.3, organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. Let me start with subclause 5.1, leadership and commitment. The subclause 5.1 of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that the top management is required to demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the FSMS by ensuring that the food safety policy and the objectives of the FSMS are established and are compatible with the strategic direction of the organization. As per this subclause, top management must establish leadership and commitment with respect to the food safety management system by ensuring the integration of the FSMS requirements into the organization's business processes. Top management must ensure that the resources needed for the FSMS are available, meeting the requirements of the standard. This subclause 5.1 says that top management is required to demonstrate leadership and commitment by communicating the importance of effective food safety management and conforming to the FSMS requirements, applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, and mutually agreed customer requirements related to food safety. According to subclause 5.1 of ISO 22000-2018, the top management must ensure that the FSMS is evaluated and maintained to achieve its intended results. This clause 5.1 states that the top management is required to show the leadership and commitment by directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the FSMS and by promoting continual improvement. Further, this subclause specifies that the top management is required to demonstrate leadership and commitment with respect to the FSMS by supporting other relevant management roles to demonstrate their leadership as it applies to their areas of responsibility. Now coming to subclause 5.2, policy of ISO 22000-2018. It has further 2 subclauses. Subclause 5.2.1, establishing the food safety policy, and subclause 5.2.2, communicating the food safety policy. Let me begin with subclause 5.2.1, establishing the food safety policy. According to the subclause 5.2.1, top management is required to establish, implement, and maintain a food safety policy that is appropriate to the purpose and context of the organization. As per this subclause, 5.2.1 standard states that food safety policy must provide a framework for setting and reviewing the objectives of the FSMS. Subclause specifies that food safety policy is required to include a commitment to satisfy applicable food safety requirements, including statutory and regulatory requirements and mutually agreed customer requirements related to food safety. The subclause 5.2.1 of ISO 22000-2018 says that food safety policy must address internal and external communication and is required to include a commitment to continuous improvement of the FSMS. This subclause also states top management is required to establish, implement, and maintain a food safety policy that addresses the need to ensure competencies related to food safety. Now, coming to subclause 5.2.2, communicating the food safety policy. The subclause 5.2.2 of ISO 22000 states that the food safety policy is required to be available and maintained as documented information. The policy must be communicated, understood, and applied at all levels within the organization. As per this subclause, food safety policy is required to be available to relevant interested parties as appropriate to meet the requirements of the standard. Friends, let's start with the subclause 5.3 now. Organizational roles, responsibilities, and authorities. The subclause 5.3.1 of ISO 22000 states that top management is required to ensure that the responsibilities and authorities for relevant roles are assigned, communicated, and understood within the organization. Clause specifies that top management is required to assign the responsibility and authority for ensuring that the FSMS conforms to the requirements of this document and for reporting on the performance of the FSMS to the top management. As per this subclause 5.3.1, the top management is required to appoint the food safety team and the food safety team leader and designated persons with defined responsibilities and authority to initiate and document actions. Now coming to the subclause 5.3.2. The clause 5.3.2 of ISO 22000 specifies that the food safety team leader must be responsible for ensuring the food safety management system. It is established, implemented, maintained, and updated. As per this subclause, food safety team leader must be responsible for managing and organizing the work of the food safety team. This is the responsibility of food safety team leader to ensure that relevant training and competencies for the food safety team is done. Subclause 5.3.2 states that food safety team leader is accountable for reporting to top management on the effectiveness and suitability of the food safety management system. Let us talk about the subclause 5.3.3 now. According to this subclause 5.3.3, all persons must have the responsibility to report problems with regards to the FSMS to identified persons. Friends, it was about the clause 5, leadership of the standard ISO 22000-2018. Now, let me start explaining the clause 6, planning of standard. Coming to the subclause 6.1, actions to address risks and opportunities. The subclause 6.1.1 of ISO 22000 says that when planning for the FSMS, the organization is required to consider the issues referred to in subclause 4.1 and the requirements referred to in subclause 4.2 and 4.3. Organization must determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to give assurance that the FSMS can achieve its intended results. As per this subclause, an organization must determine the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed to enhance desirable effects and to prevent or reduce undesired effects. Further, subclause 6.1.1 says that to achieve continual improvement, organization must determine the risks and opportunities to meet the requirements of the standard. The clause 6.1.1 guides under a note that in the context of this document, the concept of risks and opportunities is limited to events and their consequences relating to the performance and effectiveness of the FSMS. Public authorities are responsible for addressing public health risks. Organizations are required to manage food safety hazards and the requirements related to this process that is laid down in Clause 8. Let's talk now about Subclause 6.1.2. As per this clause, the organization is required to plan actions to address these risks and opportunities, and also how to integrate and implement the actions into its FSMS processes. The subclause 6.1.2 specifies that the organization is required to plan actions, how to evaluate the effectiveness of these actions. Now, coming to the subclause 6.1.3, this says that the actions taken by the organization to address risks and opportunities must be proportionate to the impact on food safety requirements, the conformity of food products and services to customers, and the requirements of interested parties in the food chain. This subclause guides under Note 1 that actions to address risks and opportunities can include avoiding risk, taking risk in order to pursue an opportunity, eliminating the risk source, changing the likelihood or consequences, sharing the risk, or accepting the presence of risk by informed decision. Under Note 2, the subclause 6.1.3 of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that opportunities can lead to the adoption of new practices, which could be modification of products or processes, using new technology and other desirable and viable possibilities to address the food safety needs of the organization or its customers. Let's talk about the clause 6.2, objectives of the food safety management system and planning to achieve them. Subclause 6.2.1 states that the organization is required to establish objectives for the FSMS at relevant functions and levels. The clause states that the objectives of the FSMS must be consistent with the food safety policy and must be measurable, if practicable. According to this clause, organization is required to take applicable food safety requirements, including statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements, into account to meet the requirement of standard. This subclause 6.2.1 states that the objectives of the FSMS must be monitored, verified, communicated, and maintained and updated as appropriate. Lastly, the subclause 6.2.1 specifies that the organization is required to retain documented information on the objectives for the FSMS. Now coming to subclause 6.2.2. This subclause 6.2.2 says that when planning how to achieve its objectives for the FSMS, the organization must determine what will be done, what resources will be required, who will be responsible, when will it be completed, and how the results will be evaluated. Let us discuss the clause 6.3, planning of changes. The clause 6.3, planning of changes of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that when the organization determines the need for changes to the FSMS, including personal changes, the changes must be carried out and communicated in a planned manner. Clause states that the organization must consider the purpose of the changes and their potential consequences and the continued integrity of the food safety management system. According to the clause 6.3, an organization is required to consider the availability of resources to effectively implement the changes and the allocation or reallocation of responsibilities and authorities to meet the requirements of the standard. Friends, we have covered the clause 6 of ISO 22000-2018. Now, let me discuss clause 7 of ISO 22000, that is support. The Clause 7 support of ISO 22000-2018 is about the execution of the plans and processes that would enable an organization to successfully complete their food safety management system responsibilities. This is a very powerful requirement covering all management system resource needs. Organizations will need to determine the necessary competence of personnel working under its control, affecting the performance of food safety management system, its ability to fulfill its obligations, and ensure they receive the suitable training. In addition, organizations need to ensure that all people doing work under the organization's control are aware of the food safety policy, how their work may impact the food safety policy, and implications of not conforming to the food safety management system. Clause 7 also specifies about the requirements for documented information which relate to the creation, updating, and control of specific data. Clause 7 of ISO 22000-2018 has further 5 subclauses, which are 7.1 Resources, 7.2 Competence, 7.3 Awareness, 7.4 Communication, 7.5 Documented Information. Let's start with the subclause 7.1 Resources. The subclause 7.1.1, the general states that the organization is required to determine and provide the resources needed for the establishment, implementation, maintenance, update, and continual improvement of the food safety management system. Subclause 7.1.1 also specifies that the organization is required to consider the capability of internal resources, any constraints on them, and the need for external resources. Coming now to subclause 7.1.2, People. According to the subclause 7.1.2 of ISO 22000-2018, the organization is required to ensure that persons necessary to operate and maintain an effective FSMS are competent. Clause further states that organization is required to retain evidence of agreement or contracts as documented information defining the competency, responsibility, and authority of external experts. When the assistance of external experts is used for the development, implementation, operation, or assessment of the food safety management system. Let me talk about subclause 7.1.3, Infrastructure. This subclause 7.1.3 of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that the organization is required to provide the resources for the determination, establishment, and maintenance of the infrastructure necessary to achieve conformity with the requirements of the food safety management system. Subclause 7.1.3 guides under a note and says that infrastructure can include land, vessels, buildings, and associated utilities, equipment including hardware and software, transportation, and information and communication technology. Coming to the subclause 7.1.4, Work Environment. As per this subclause, the organization is required to determine, provide, and maintain the resources for the establishment, management, and maintenance of the work environment necessary to achieve conformity with the requirements of the FSMS. The subclause provides guidance under a note in standard and specifies that suitable environment can be a combination of human and physical factors such as social, example, non-discriminatory, calm, non-confrontational, psychological, example, stress-reducing, burnout prevention, emotionally protective, physical, example, temperature, heat, humidity, light, airflow, hygiene, noise. Subclause also states that these factors can differ substantially depending on the products and services being provided by the organization. Let's talk now about the subclause 7.1.5, externally developed elements of the food safety management system. This subclause 7.1.5 of ISO 22000 says that when an organization establishes, maintains, updates, and continually improves its FSMS by using externally developed elements of an FSMS, including PRPs, the hazard analysis, and the hazard control plan, the organization is required to ensure that the provided elements are developed in conformance with requirements of this document, applicable to the sites, processes, and products of the organization, specifically adapted to the processes and products of the organization by the food safety team, implemented, maintained, and updated as required by this document, and retained as documented information. Coming to the subclause 7.1.6 of ISO 22000, that is, control of externally provided processes, products, or services. According to the subclause 7.1.6, the organization is required to establish and apply criteria for the evaluation, selection, monitoring of performance, and reevaluation of external providers of processes, products, or services. The clause says that organization is required to ensure adequate communication of requirements to the external providers. Organization is also required to ensure that externally provided processes, products, or services do not adversely affect the organization's ability to consistently meet the requirements of the FSMS. As per this subclause 7.1.6, organization must retain documented information of these activities and any necessary actions as a result of the evaluations and re-evaluations. Let me explain the clause 7.1, resource in general. According to clause 7.1, resource, the requirements are to check that organization has identified which resources it needs to make available in order to ensure the effective operation of the food safety management system. Resources will often include raw materials, infrastructure, finance, personnel, and technology, all of which can be either internally or externally provided. Having sufficient resources is vital to ensure product and service conformity and satisfy customer requirements. Example, having adequate workforces, finance, and equipment to ensure timely delivery of products and services. Many organizations can run into food safety management system non-conformities as a result of insufficient or improper use of resources. The organization should identify the internal and external resources that are needed for the achievement of the organization's objectives in the short and long term. The organization's policies and methods for resource management should be consistent with its strategy. As part of its strategic planning, top management must decide what resources it must develop, acquire, or outsource to be competitive. Due to the ever-changing dynamics of the business environment, these resources and competitive advantages must be constantly upgraded or altered to enable your organization to maintain its competitive advantage relative to other firms. To ensure that resources such as equipment, infrastructural facilities, raw materials, knowledge, finance, and workers are used effectively and efficiently, it is necessary to have food safety management system processes in place to provide, allocate, monitor, evaluate, optimize, maintain, and protect those resources. Let us now discuss the clause 7.2, competence of ISO 22000-2018. According to this subclause, the organization must determine the necessary competence of persons, including external providers, doing work under its control that affects its food safety performance and effectiveness of the FSMS. The subclause 7.2 states that organization is required to ensure that these persons, including the food safety team and those responsible for the operation of the hazard control plan, are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, and experience. Organization must ensure that the food safety team has a combination of multidisciplinary knowledge and experience in developing and implementing the food safety management system. It should include the organization's products, processes, equipment, and food safety hazards within the scope of the FSMS, but organization should not be limited to it. The clause 7.2 states that organization must take actions to acquire the necessary competence and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken wherever applicable. Further, subclause 7.2 specifies that organization is required to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of competence. Lastly, the standard through this clause 7.2 guides under a note and states that applicable actions can include, for example, the provision of training to, the mentoring of, or the reassignment of currently employed persons, or the hiring or contracting of competent persons. Let's come to the next clause 7.3, Awareness of ISO 22000-2018. The clause 7.3 states that the organization is required to ensure that all relevant persons doing work under the organization's control must be aware of the food safety policy, the objectives of the FSMS relevant to their tasks, their individual contribution to the effectiveness of the FSMS, including the benefits of improved food safety performance and the implications of not conforming with the FSMS requirements. Let me explain this clause 7.3, Awareness in general. Subject to the size and values of the organization, a wide range of approaches can be engaged for awareness of the food safety policy and objectives, from regular meetings, sessions, talks, notices, leaflets, and publication of food safety metrics to the inclusion and participation of individuals in cross-functional teams and improvement initiatives. Job descriptions, training records, work instructions, and minutes of performance review meetings are some examples not only of ways in which staff can be made aware of their specific contributions and implications of non-conformance, but also as documented evidence of such. Let's discuss about awareness training. Organizations do not need to conduct long theory sessions for awareness training. Training techniques can involve short training programs accompanied with tutorial videos and hands-on demonstrations that address key elements of the food safety management system. Communication via circulars, electronic bulletin boards, posters, and informational meetings are other procedures to promote and strengthen the food safety management awareness training. The requirements for general awareness training apply to all employees, including those whose work may cause significant impacts or food safety management risks. Awareness training is intended to provide an overview of the organization's energy policy, objectives and targets, and overall food safety management system. Organization must establish and maintain procedures to make its employees and members at each relevant function and level aware of the importance of conformance with the policy and the food safety management system procedures and requirements. It should also include the actual and the potential significant impacts and risks of the activities, products, or services. Awareness procedure should make employees aware with the benefits of improved personal performance and the employee's roles and responsibilities in achieving conformance with policies and procedures. Organization must establish and maintain procedures to make its employees aware with their roles and responsibilities towards emergency awareness and response and potential consequences of departure from specified operating procedures. Let us understand now the next clause, 7.4, communication. Let us start with an example. Examples of communication may include dealing with FSMS grievances or proactively inviting such stakeholders and responding to media inquiries, especially in the event of an incident. A failure to communicate effectively within initial few hours of an incident could seriously decrease the company's ability to control the situation. This will undercut the company's reputation in the minds of staff, customers, the media, and the public. Effective internal communications require mechanisms for information to flow top down and bottom up. Employees are often an outstanding source of information, issues, and ideas. Communicating with external parties is also significant for effective food safety management. Information from external sources can be critical in setting food safety management system and other business goals. The clause 7.4 requires the organization to have in place a system of communication that ensures that those within the organization are kept informed regarding the FSMS and food safety management issues associated with the organization's operations, and that communication from external interested parties is received and handled according to the established process. The function of clause 7.4, communication, is to support the achievement of the FSMS policy and objectives and the functioning of the FSMS in general. The clause requirement that information regarding the FSMS aspects and FSMS elements be communicated to personnel within the organization is intended to assist the organization in achieving its FSMS objectives as well as the commitments and overall goals expressed in the food safety policy. Employees who are fully informed of all the issues surrounding the FSMS and who feel included in the process are more likely to be motivated and committed to achieving the organization's objectives and targets and overall FSMS goals. Likewise, the limited requirements for communication with the external parties are designed to foster a more understanding and cooperative relationship between the organization and stakeholders, regulatory agencies, and FSMS groups. Communication of the food safety policy will also form an important part of internal communication, as a key part of the communication program will involve making sure that employees understand the food safety policy. In order to develop effective processes for internal and external communication, it is useful to have an understanding of what is encompassed by the terms internal communication and external communication and what the ultimate goal is of such processes. Let me start with Subclause 7.4.1 General. According to the Subclause 7.4.1 General, the organization is required to determine the internal and external communications relevant to the FSMS, including on what it will communicate, when to communicate, with whom to communicate, how to communicate, and who communicates. Subclause 7.4.1 states that the organization must ensure that the requirement for effective communication is understood by all persons whose activities have an impact on food safety. Let me explain now the Subclause 7.4.2, External Communication. The Subclause 7.4.2 of ISO 22000 states that the organization is required to ensure that sufficient information is communicated externally and is available for interested parties of the food chain. As per this subclause, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communications with external providers and contractors. Organization is also required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communication with customers or customers in relation to product information related to food safety, to enable the handling, display, storage, preparation, distribution, and use of the product within the food chain or by the consumer. Identified foods safety hazards that need to be controlled by other organizations in the food chain and or by consumers. Contractual arrangements, inquiries and orders, including their amendments. Customer and or consumer feedback, including complaints. As per this subclause 7.4.2, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communications with statutory and regulatory authorities. According to this subclause, the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain effective communications with other organizations that have an impact on or will be affected by the effectiveness or updating of the FSMS. Subclause further specifies that designated persons must have defined responsibilities and authority for the external communication of any information concerning food safety. Where relevant information obtained through external communication must be included as input for management review and for updating the FSMS. Lastly, the subclause 7.4.2 states that organization is required to retain the evidence of external communication as documented information. Coming to subclause 7.4.3, internal communication. The subclause 7.4.3 of ISO 22000 states that the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain an effective system for communicating issues having an impact on food safety. As per this subclause, to maintain the effectiveness of the FSMS, the organization must ensure that the food safety team is informed in a timely manner of changes in products or new products, raw materials, ingredients and services, production systems and equipment, production premises, location of equipment and surrounding environment, cleaning and sanitation programs, packaging, storage and distribution systems, competencies and or allocation of responsibilities and authorizations, applicable statutory and regulatory requirements, knowledge regarding food safety hazards and control measures, customer, sector and other requirements that the organization observes, relevant inquiries and communication from external interested parties, complaints and alerts indicating food safety hazards associated with the end product, other conditions that have an impact on food safety. Clause 7.4.3 specifies that the food safety team is required to ensure that this information is included when updating the FSMS. Lastly, the subclause 7.4.3 says that top management is required to ensure that relevant information is included as input to the management review. Let us discuss the clause 7.5, documented information. The term documented information is meant to describe any information that is required to be controlled and maintained by the organization and the medium on which it is contained. Documented information can refer to the food safety management system and its processes, documentation and records. So in brief, it includes anything that organization requires to be recorded to make sure its FSMS functions properly and that organization can demonstrate that this is the case. In this, the requirements for documented information are captured and they are fairly basic. A document is information that is written or recorded on some medium such as paper or computer. A document may specify requirements, for example, a flow chart or technical specification may provide direction, for example, food recipes, or show results or evidence of activities performed, for example, customer feedback. The term documented information is used for all document requirements in ISO 22000-2018. The need to have additional documentation beyond those specified in this standard may depend upon compliance obligations, including regulatory requirements and your own organizational requirements. Other factors to consider may include the complexity of products or services and processes, type of activities, FSMS issues, significant food safety management aspects, economic risk, effectiveness and efficiency, the competence of personnel. This information is expected to be tailored to organization because it is noted that the extent of the documented information can differ due to the size of the organization, the complexity of the organization, and the competence of the people. The organization is responsible for determining what documented information needs to be retained, the period of time for which it is to be retained, and the media to be used for its retention. The requirement to maintain documented information may also include the possibility that the organization can retain that same documented information for a particular purpose, for example, to retain previous versions of it. Lastly, there are requirements for the control of documented information, particularly how it is available and suitable for use, it is adequately protected, it is distributed applicably, and access, retrieval, use, storage, and preservation are controlled. Finally, there needs to be control of changes, retention of documented information, and disposition when these documents are removed from use. If you look closely, you will see that these requirements are very much the same as those already in place for documented procedures and records, only merged into one set of requirements. Many people make the mistake of changing the definitions that they use in their management system to match those in the standard when this is not a requirement. The standard is not there to dictate what you will call something or even how you will number any document that are in your system. If you want to continue to use the terms procedure and record because this is what the people in your company understand, then go ahead. The requirements of the clause 7.5 of ISO 22000 standard are there to give you a framework to build a food safety management system that works the best for your organization in your effort to meet legal requirements and improve your service management performance. Now, let's talk about its subclauses. Clause 7.5 documented information has the subclauses as 7.5.1 General, 7.5.2 Creating and Updating, 7.5.3 Control of Documented Information. Let's start with the subclause 7.5.1 General. This subclause 7.5.1 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the organization's FSMS must include documented information required by the standard. Organization's FSMS is required to include documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the FSMS. As per this clause, organization is required to include documented information and food safety requirements required by statutory, regulatory authorities and customers. Subclause 7.5.1 also guides and says under a note that the extent of documented information for an FSMS can differ from one organization to another organization due to the size of the organization and its type of activities, processes, products, and services, the complexity of processes and their interactions, the competence of persons. Coming now to subclause 7.5.2, Creating and Updating. This subclause of ISO 22000-2018 states that when creating and updating documented information, the organization must ensure appropriate identification and description, for example, a title, date, author, or reference number, and the format, for example, language, version, graphics, and media, example, paper or electronic. Organization is also required to ensure appropriate review and approval for suitability and adequacy of documented information. Let us talk about the subclause 7.5.3, Control of Documented Information. The subclause 7.5.3.1 states that the documented information required by the FSMS and by the standard must be controlled to ensure that it is available and suitable for use where and when it is needed. As per this clause, documented information required by the FSMS and by this standard must also be controlled to ensure that it is adequately protected from loss of confidentiality, improper use, or loss of integrity. Coming to subclause 7.5.3.2 now. This clause 7.5.3.2 specifies that for the control of documented information, the organization must address the activities as applicable, like distribution, access, retrieval and use, storage and preservation, including preservation of legibility, control of changes, example, version control, retention and disposition. Subclause further states that the documented information of external origin determined by the organization to be necessary for the planning and operation of the FSMS is required to be identified as appropriate and controlled. According to this subclause 7.5.3.2, documented information retained as evidence of conformity must be protected from unintended alterations. Lastly, the clause guides and states under a note that access can imply a decision regarding the permission to view the documented information only, or the permission and authority to view and change the documented information. Friends, we have now completed the clause 7 of ISO 22000-2018. Let's start with the subclause 8.1, Operational Planning and Control. This clause 8.1 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the organization is required to plan, implement, control, maintain, and update the processes needed to meet requirements for the realization of safe products and to implement the actions determined in subclause 6.1 of the standard by establishing criteria for the processes, implementing control of the processes in accordance with the criteria, and keeping documented information to the extent necessary to have the confidence to demonstrate that the processes have been carried out as planned. Subclause specifies that the organization must control planned changes and review the consequences of unintended changes, taking action to mitigate any adverse effects as necessary. Lastly, the clause 8.1 of ISO 22000 states that the organization must ensure that outsourced processes are controlled. Let us understand this subclause 8.1. If you are setting up a food safety management system in the direction that the standard has been written, you will have arrived at clause 8 of the standard with risks, opportunities, and objectives that need to be considered when establishing the food safety management system. Without this understanding in hand, you could develop a management system that does not address these risks and opportunities or supports the setting objectives. The standard requires us to establish criteria for the processes, or, in other words, what performance processes are desirable to determine the effectiveness of processes in the FSMS. These might include performance against targets, numbers of occurrences and problems, lost and gained services, volumes against supply and demand, security breaches, customer satisfaction and complaints, plus much more. These measures must be appropriate to each individual business. Don't measure and monitor things that do not bring service improvement or customer satisfaction. Once you understand the measurement criteria, you can initiate to build the food safety management system to meet these requirements, implementing control of the processes in accordance with the criteria, performance criteria communicated through SLAs, OLAs, and KPIs. A good management system doesn't end there, as it will have determined What documented information needs to be kept to exhibit achievement of measures and compliance to the standard. The control of scheduled changes and the evaluation of the consequences of unintended changes leave many with a challenge. We all understand planned changes, especially if we have an effective change management process in place, which will naturally control planned changes. However, the consequences of unintended change are a little unclear, probably because it covers a broad subject. So let's cover this further. Unintended change might result from process creep, where a process has been developed and moved away from its agreed path without consultation with other departments that might be affected. And the consequence is the unintended change brought upon other processes which rely on the initial process that has been changed. Other areas where the consequences of unintended change may be found are related to impacts of incidents, problems, and non-conformities, where the errors have impacts that are either unexpected or unintended and need further consideration. Another example in relation to this standard is service creep, where items of equipment owned by a customer and outside the contracted service agreement are accepted up in the service contract because of poor asset management and configuration management. And you effectively end up servicing equipment for free. If these types of things occur, it is important that the actions are investigated through to root cause level to prevent their repetition. Coming now to Clause 8.2, Prerequisite Programs, PRPs. The Subclause 8.2.1 specifies that the organization is required to establish, implement, maintain, and update PRPs to facilitate the prevention and or reduction of contaminants, including food safety hazards, in the products, product processing, and work environment. The clause 8.2.2 states that the PRPs must be appropriate to the organization and its context with regards to food safety, and appropriate to the size and type of the operation and the nature of the products being manufactured and or handled. As per this subclause, the PRPs must be implemented across the entire production system, either as programs applicable in general or as programs applicable to a particular product or process. According to subclause 8.2.2, PRPs must be approved by the food safety team to meet the requirements of the standard. Coming now to subclause 8.2.3. This subclause 8.2.3 states that when selecting or establishing PRPs, the organization is required to ensure that applicable statutory, regulatory, and mutually agreed customer requirements are identified. According to this subclause, the organization should consider the applicable part of the ISO TS 22002 series and applicable standards, codes of practice, and guidelines. Let us talk about clause 8.2.4. The subclause 8.2.4 states that when establishing PRPs, the organization is required to consider construction, layout of buildings and associated utilities, layout of the premises including zoning, workspace and employee facilities, supplies of air, water, energy and other utilities, pest control, waste and sewage disposal and supporting services, the suitability of equipment and its accessibility for cleaning and maintenance, supplier approval and assurance processes, example, raw materials, ingredients, chemicals and packaging, reception of incoming materials, storage, dispatch, transportation and handling of products, measures for the prevention of cross-contamination, cleaning and disinfecting, personal hygiene, product information or consumer awareness, and others as appropriate. The subclause 8.2.4 also states that documented information must specify the selection, establishment, applicable monitoring, and verification of the PRPs. Coming now to the clause 8.3 of ISO 22000-2018, that is Traceability System. According to this clause 8.3 of ISO 22000-2018, the traceability system must be able to uniquely identify incoming material from the suppliers and the first stage of the distribution route of the end product. Clause 8.3 states that when establishing and implementing the traceability system, the organization is required to consider parameters like relation of lots of received materials, ingredients and intermediate products to the end products, reworking of materials or products, and the distribution of the end product. This clause also states that the organization is required to ensure that applicable statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements are identified. As per clause 8.3, traceability system, the organization is required to retain documented information as evidence of the traceability system for a defined period to include, as a minimum, the shelf life of the product. The organization is also required to verify and test the effectiveness of the traceability system. Finally, the clause 8.3 provides guidance and states under a note that where appropriate, the verification of the system is expected to include the reconciliation of quantities of end products with the quantity of ingredients as evidence of effectiveness. Coming now to the clause 8.4, emergency preparedness and response. Let's begin with the subclause 8.4.1 general. The subclause 8.4.1 general of ISO 22000-2018 states that the top management is required to ensure procedures are in place to respond to potential emergency situations or incidents that can have an impact on food safety, which are relevant to the role of the organization in the food chain. Subclause 8.4.1 says that an organization is required to establish and maintain the documented information to manage emergency situations and incidents. Coming now to clause 8.4.2, handling of emergencies and incidents. As per this subclause 8.4.2, the organization is required to respond to actual emergency situations and incidents by ensuring that the applicable statutory and regulatory requirements are identified. Organization is also required to respond to actual emergency situations and incidents by communicating internally and externally with suppliers, customers, appropriate authorities, and media, etc. This clause says that organization must take actions to reduce the consequences of the emergency situations, appropriate to the magnitude of the emergency or incident and the potential food safety impact. As per this subclause 8.4.2 of ISO 22000, organization is required to test procedures periodically where practical. Organization must review and update the documented information after the occurrence of any incident, emergency situation, or tests wherever necessary. Lastly, the subclause states under a note that examples of emergency situations that can affect food safety and or production are natural disasters, environmental accidents, bioterrorism, workplace accidents, public health emergencies, and other accidents. Example, interruption of essential services such as water, electricity, or refrigeration supply. Let us talk about the clause 8.5 of ISO 22000-2018, that is hazard control. Let me begin with this subclause 8.5.1, preliminary steps to enable hazard analysis. The subclause 8.5.1.1 general specifies that to carry out the hazard analysis, preliminary documented information must be collected. maintained and updated by the food safety team. This must include, but not be limited to, applicable statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements, the organization's products, processes, and equipment, and food safety hazards relevant to the FSMS. Coming now to the Subclause 8.5.1.2, characteristics of raw materials, ingredients, and product contact materials. According to this subclause, the organization is required to ensure that all applicable statutory and regulatory food safety requirements are identified for all raw materials, ingredients, and product contact materials. Subclause 8.5.1.2 states that the organization is required to maintain documented information concerning all raw materials, ingredients, and product contact materials to the extent needed to conduct the hazard analysis, including the aspects like biological, chemical, and physical characteristics, composition of formulated ingredients, including additives and processing aids, source, example, animal, mineral, or vegetable, place of origin, provenance, method of production, method of packaging and delivery, storage conditions and shelf life, preparation and or handling before use or processing, and acceptance criteria related to food safety or specifications of purchased materials and ingredients appropriate to their intended use. Let us discuss the subclause 8.5.1.3, characteristics of end products. The subclause 8.5.1.3 states that the organization is required to ensure that all applicable statutory and regulatory food safety requirements are identified for all the end products intended to be produced. This clause further specifies that the organization must maintain documented information concerning the characteristics of end products to the extent needed to conduct the hazard analysis, including information on the parameters like product name or similar identification, composition, biological, chemical, and physical characteristics relevant for food safety, intended shelf life and storage conditions, packaging, labeling relating to food safety, and or instructions for handling, preparation, and intended use, and methods of distribution and delivery. Coming to subclause 8.5.1.4, intended use. This subclause says that the organization is required to consider the intended use, including reasonably expected handling of the end product and any unintended use but reasonably expected mishandling and misuse of the end product. According to this subclause, organization is required to maintain them as documented information to the extent needed to conduct the hazard analysis. Subclause 8.5.1.4 specifies that groups of consumers and users shall be identified for each product, wherever appropriate, and groups of consumers and users known to be especially vulnerable to specific food safety hazards are also required to be identified. Now let us talk about the subclause 8.5.1.5, flow diagrams and description of processes. Coming to clause 8.5.1.5.1, preparation of the flow of diagrams. This subclause 8.5.1.5.1 states that the food safety team is required to establish, maintain, and update flow diagrams as documented information for the products or product categories and processes covered by the food safety management system. As we know that flow diagrams provide a graphic representation of the process. Flow diagrams must be used by organization when conducting the hazard analysis as a basis for evaluating the possible occurrence, increase, decrease, or introduction of food safety hazards. As per this subclause, flow diagrams must be clear, accurate, and sufficiently detailed to the extent needed to conduct the hazard analysis. As appropriate, flow diagrams must include the sequence and interaction of the steps in the operation, any outsourced processes, where raw materials, ingredients, processing aids, packaging materials, utilities, and intermediate products enter the flow, where reworking and recycling take place, and where end products, intermediate products, byproducts, and waste are released or removed. Let us understand Subclause 8.5.1.5.2 On-site confirmation of flow diagrams. This subclause 8.5.1.5.2 specifies that the food safety team is required to confirm on-site the accuracy of the flow diagrams. Food safety teams update the flow diagrams where appropriate and must retain as documented information to meet the requirements of the standard. Coming now to the subclause 8.5.1.5.3. Description of processes and processes environment now. This subclause states that the food safety team must describe to the extent needed to conduct the hazard analysis, the layout of premises, including food and non-food handling areas. As per this clause, the food safety team is required to describe the processing equipment and contact materials, processing aids and flow of materials to the extent needed to conduct the hazard analysis. 8.5.1.5.3 says that the food safety team is required to describe the existing PRPs, process parameters, control measures, and the strictness with which they are applied, or procedures that can influence food safety. According to this subclause, the food safety team is required to describe the external requirements like from statutory and regulatory authorities or customers that can impact the choice and the strictness of the control measures. Subclause says that the variations resulting from expected seasonal changes or shift patterns must be included by food safety team as appropriate. Lastly, this subclause states that the descriptions must be updated and maintained as documented information as appropriate. Let us talk now about the subclause 8.5.2 of ISO 22000-2018, that is hazard analysis. The subclause 8.5.2.1 general specifies that the food safety team is required to conduct a hazard analysis based on the preliminary information to determine the hazards that need to be controlled. This clause says that the degree of control must ensure food safety and, wherever appropriate, a combination of control measures must be used to meet the requirements of the standard. Now coming to the subclause 8.5.2.2, hazard identification and determination of acceptable levels. This subclause 8.5.2.2.1 states that the organization is required to identify and document all food safety hazards that are reasonably expected to occur in relation to the type of the product, type of process, and the process environment. As per clause, the identification must be based on the preliminary information and data collected in accordance with subclause 8.5.1 of the standard. Experience, internal and external information, including to the extent possible, epidemiological, scientific, and other historical data, information from the food chain on food safety hazards related to the safety of the end products, intermediate products, and the food at the time of consumption, and statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements. The subclause also provides guidance and states under Note 1 that experience can include information from staff and external experts who are familiar with the product and or processes in other facilities. Under Note 2, the subclause guides that the statutory and regulatory requirements can include food safety objectives, FSOs. The Codex Alimentarius Commission defines food safety objectives as the maximum frequency and or concentration of a hazard in a food at the time of consumption that provides or contributes to the appropriate level of protection, ALOP. Lastly, Subclause 8.5.2.2.1 states that hazards should be considered in sufficient detail to enable hazard assessment and the selection of appropriate control measures. Now coming to Subclause 8.5.2.2.2. As per this subclause, the organization is required to identify steps like receiving raw materials, processing, distribution and delivery, at which each food safety hazard can be present, be introduced, increased or persist. Subclause says that when identifying hazards, the organization must consider the stages preceding and following in the food chain, all steps in the flow diagram, and the process equipment, utilities, services, process environment, and persons. Let us understand the subclause 8.5.2.2.3. This subclause says that the organization is required to determine the acceptable level in the end product of each food safety hazard identified whenever possible. Clause further states that when determining acceptable levels, the organization must ensure that applicable statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements are identified, consider the intended use of end products, consider any other relevant information. Lastly, this subclause 8.5.2.2.3 specifies that the organization is required to maintain documented information concerning the determination of acceptable levels and the justification for the acceptable levels. Let me talk about subclause 8.5.2.3, hazard assessment. According to this subclause, for each identified food safety hazard, the organization is required to conduct a hazard assessment to determine whether its prevention or reduction to an acceptable level is essential. The organization is also required to evaluate each food safety hazard with regards to the likelihood of its occurrence in the end product prior to application of control measures and the severity of its adverse health effects in relation to the intended use. The organization shall identify any significant food safety hazards. Subclause 8.5.2.3 states that the methodology used must be described and the result of the hazard assessment must be maintained as documented information. Coming now to subclause 8.5.2.4, selection and categorization of control measures. The subclause 8.5.2.4.1 specifies that, based on the hazard assessment, the organization shall select an appropriate control measure or combination of control measures that will be capable of preventing or reducing the identified significant food safety hazards to defined acceptable levels. Subclause says that the organization must categorize the selected identified control measures to be managed as operational prerequisite programs or at critical control points. As per this subclause, the categorization is required to be carried out using a systematic approach. For each of the control measures selected, there must be an assessment of the likelihood of failure of its functioning. There must also be an assessment of the severity of the consequence in the case of failure of its functioning. This assessment must include the effect on identified significant food safety hazards, the location in relation to other control measures, whether it is specifically established and applied to reduce the hazards to an acceptable level, and whether it is a single measure or is part of combination of control measures. Let us understand the subclause 8.5.2.4.2. In addition, For each control measure, the systematic approach must include an assessment of the feasibility of establishing measurable critical limits and or measurable observable action criteria, monitoring to detect any failure to remain within critical limit and or measurable or observable action criteria, and applying timely corrections in case of failure. According to this subclause, the organization is required to maintain the decision-making process and results of the selection and categorization of the control measures as documented information. Organization is also required to maintain the external requirements, example, statutory, regulatory, and customer requirements that can impact the choice and the strictness of the control measures as documented information to meet out the requirements of the standard. Now let me talk about the subclause 8.5.3, validation of control measures and combinations of control measures. The subclause 8.5.3 specifies that the food safety team is required to validate that the selected control measures are capable of achieving the intended control of the significant food safety hazards. As per this clause, this validation must be done prior to implementation of control measures and combinations of control measures to be included in the hazard control plan and after any change therein. Subclause says that when the result of validation shows that the control measures are not capable of achieving the intended control, the food safety team is required to modify and reassess the control measures and combinations of control measures. Lastly, the subclause 8.5.3 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the food safety team is required to maintain the validation methodology and evidence of capability of the control measures to achieve the intended control as documented information. This clause also guides and states under a note that modification can include changes in control measures, that is, process parameters, rigor and their combination, and changes in the manufacturing technologies for raw materials, end product characteristics, methods of distribution, and intended use of the end product. Coming to clause 8.5.4, Hazard Control Plan, HACCP or Oprp plan. The subclause 8.5.4.1 general says that the organization must establish, implement, and maintain a hazard control plan. The hazard control plan is required to be maintained as documented information and must include the information for each control measure at each CCP or OPRP, like food safety hazards, to be controlled at the CCP or by the OPRP. Critical limits at CCP or action criteria for OPRP. Monitoring procedures. Corrections to be made if critical limits or action criteria are not met. Responsibilities and authorities and the records of monitoring. Let me explain the subclause 8.5.4.2, determination of critical limits and action criteria. This clause says that the critical limits at CCPs and action criteria for OPRPs must be specified. The rationales for their determination are required to be maintained as documented information. Critical limits at CCPs must be measurable. Conformance with critical limits must ensure that the acceptable level is not exceeded. Action criteria for OPRPs must be measurable or observable. Conformance with action criteria must contribute to the assurance that the acceptable level is not exceeded. Let's understand the subclause 8.5.4.3, monitoring systems at CCPs and for OPRPs. According to the subclause 8.5.4.3, at each CCP, a monitoring system is required to be established for each control measure or combination of control measures to detect any failure to remain within the critical limits. The system must include all scheduled measurements relative to the critical limits. Clause says that For each OPRP, a monitoring system must be established for the control measure or combination of control measures to detect failure to meet the action criterion. As per this subclause 8.5.4.3 of ISO 22000-2018, the monitoring system at each CCP and for each OPRP is required to consist of documented information, including measurements or observations that provide results within an adequate time frame, monitoring methods or devices used, applicable calibration methods or OPRPs, equivalent methods for verification of reliable measurements or observations, monitoring frequency, monitoring results, responsibility and authority related to monitoring, and responsibility and authority related to evaluation of monitoring results. Subclause specifies that at each CCP, the monitoring method and frequency must be capable of timely detection of any failure to remain within critical limits to allow timely isolation and evaluation of the product. For each OPRP, the monitoring method and frequency must be proportionate to the likelihood of failure and the severity of consequences. The subclause 8.5.4.3 states that when monitoring an OPRP is based on a subjective data from observations, example visual inspection, the method must be supported by instructions or specifications. Let us understand the subclause 8.5.4.4 actions when critical limits or action criteria are not met. The subclause 8.5.4.4 states that the organization is required to specify corrections and corrective actions to be taken when critical limits or action criterion are not met and must ensure that the potentially unsafe products are not released, the cause of non-conformity is identified, the parameters controlled at the CCP or by the OPRP are returned within the critical limits or action criteria, and recurrence is prevented. Clause further states that the organization is required to make corrections in accordance with subclause 8.9.2 and corrective actions in accordance with subclause 8.9.3 of the standard. Coming to subclause 8.5.4.5, implementation of the hazard control plan. The subclause 8.5.4.5 specifies that the organization is required to implement and maintain the hazard control plan. As per this clause, organization is also required to retain evidence of the implementation as documented information. Let us understand now the clause 8.6, updating the information, specifying the PRPs and the hazard control plan. The clause 8.6 of ISO 22000-2018 states that following the establishment of the hazard control plan, the organization, if necessary, is required to update the information like characteristics of raw materials, ingredients and product contact materials, characteristics of end products, intended use, and flow diagrams and descriptions of processes and process environment. Clause 8.6 specifies that the organization must ensure that the hazard control plan and the PRPs are up to date. Coming to clause 8.7, control of monitoring and measuring now. The clause 8.7 specifies that the organization is required to provide evidence that the specified monitoring and measuring methods and equipment in use are adequate for the monitoring and measuring activities related to the PRPs and the hazard control plan. This clause states that the monitoring and measuring equipment used must be calibrated or verified at specified intervals prior to use. Monitoring and measuring equipment used must be adjusted or readjusted as necessary and must be identified to enable the calibration status to be determined. As per clause 8.7, the monitoring and measuring equipment used must be safeguarded from adjustments that would invalidate the measurement results and must also be protected from damage and deterioration. This clause 8.7 of ISO 22000 specifies that the organization is required to retain the results of calibration and verification as documented information. The calibration of all the equipment must be traceable to international or national measurement standards. And if no standards exist, organization is required to retain the basis used for calibration or verification as documented information. This clause says that the organization must assess the validity of the previous measurement results when the equipment or process environment is found not to conform to requirements. The organization must take appropriate action in relation to the equipment or process environment and any product affected by the non-conformance. Further, the clause states that the organization is required to retain the assessment and resulting action as documented information. Clause 8.7, Control of Monitoring and Measuring, says that the software used in monitoring and measuring within the food safety management system must be validated by the organization. The organization is also required to validate the software supplier or third party prior to use. As per this clause, organization is required to maintain the documented information on validation activities, and the software must also be updated in a timely manner. And whenever there are changes, including software configuration or modifications to commercial off-the-shelf software, they must be authorized, documented, and validated before implementation. Lastly, the clause guides and states under a note that commercial off-the-shelf software in general used within its designed application range can be considered to be sufficiently validated. Let us talk about the clause 8.8 of ISO 22000-2018, that is, verification related to PRPs and the hazard control plan. The subclause 8.8.1 verification states that the organization is required to establish, implement, and maintain verification activities. The verification planning must define purpose, methods, frequencies, and responsibilities for the verification activities. According to clause 8.8.1, the verification activities must confirm that the PRPs and hazard control plan are implemented and effective. This subclause says that the verification activities must confirm that hazard levels are within identified acceptable levels, and the input to the hazard analysis is updated. As per this subclause 8.8.1, the verification activities must confirm that the other actions determined by the organization are implemented and effective. The organization must ensure that verification activities are not carried out by the person responsible for monitoring the same activities. This subclause states that verification results must be retained by organization as documented information, and this must also be communicated. Where verification is based on testing of end product samples or direct process samples, and where such test samples show non-conformity with the acceptable level of the food safety hazard, the organization is required to handle the affected lots of product as potentially unsafe and apply corrective actions in accordance with clause 8.9.3. Coming to subclause 8.8.2, analysis of results of verification activities. The subclause 8.8.2 states that the food safety team is required to conduct an analysis of the result of verification that must be used as an input to the performance evaluation of the food safety management system. Let us talk about the clause 8.9, control of product and process non-conformities. The subclause 8.9.1 general specifies that the organization is required to ensure that data derived from the monitoring of OPRPs and CCPs are evaluated by designated persons who are competent and have the authority to initiate corrections and corrective actions. Coming to Subclause 8.9.2, Corrections. The Subclause 8.9.2.1 of ISO 22000-2018 states that the organization is required to ensure that when critical limits at CCPs and action criteria for OPRPs are not met, the products affected are identified and controlled with regards to their use and release. The subclause says that the organization must establish, maintain, and update documented information, including a method of identification, assessment, and correction for affected products to ensure their proper handling, and the arrangements for review of the corrections carried out. The subclause 8.9.2.2 says that when critical limits at CCPs are not met, affected products must be identified and handled as potentially unsafe products. Coming to subclause 8.9.2.3 now. This subclause says that where action criteria for an OPRP are not met, the organization must carry out determination of the consequences of that failure with respect to food safety, determination of the causes of failure, and identification of the affected products and handling in accordance with subclause 8.9.4 of the standard. The organization shall retain results of the evaluation as documented information. Let me explain the subclause 8.9.2.4 now. This subclause 8.9.2.4 states that the documented information must be retained to describe corrections made on non-conforming products and processes, including the nature of the non-conformity, causes of the failure, and the consequences as a result of the non-conformity. Let us discuss the subclause 8.9.3, Corrective Actions of ISO 22000-2018. This subclause specifies that the organization is required to evaluate the need for corrective actions when critical limits at CCPs and action criteria for OPRPs are not met. As per this subclause, to prevent recurrence, the organization is required to establish and maintain documented information and specifies appropriate actions to identify and eliminate the cause of detected non-conformities and to return the process to control after non-conformity is identified. These actions must include reviewing non-conformities identified by customer and consumer complaints and regulatory inspection reports, reviewing trends in monitoring results that can indicate loss of control, and determining the cause or causes of non-conformities. As per clause 8.9.3, these actions must include determining and implementing actions to ensure that the non-conformities do not recur, documenting the results of corrective actions taken, and verifying the corrective actions taken to ensure that they are effective. Lastly, this subclause 8.9.3 states that the organization is required to retain documented information on all corrective actions. Coming now to the subclause 8.9.4, handling of potentially unsafe products. Let me begin with the subclause 8.9.4.1 general. The subclause 8.9.4.1 general specifies that the organization is required to take actions to prevent potentially unsafe products from entering the food chain, unless it can demonstrate that the food safety hazards of concern are reduced to the defined acceptable levels. The food safety hazards of concern will be reduced to identified acceptable levels prior to entering the food chain. The product still meets the defined acceptable levels of the food safety hazards of concern despite the non-conformity. This subclause states that the organization must retain products that have been identified as potentially unsafe under its control until the products have been evaluated and the disposition has been determined. If the products that have left the control of the organization are subsequently determined to be unsafe, the organization must notify relevant interested parties and initiate a withdrawal or recall. Subclause 8.9.4.1 states that the organization is required to retain controls and related responses from relevant interested parties and authorization for dealing with potentially unsafe products as documented information. Coming to the subclause 8.9.4.2, evaluation for release. According to the subclause 8.9.4.2 of the standard, organization is required to evaluate each lot of products affected by the non-conformity. Products affected by failure to remain within critical limits at CCPs must not be released, but must be handled in accordance with subclause 8.9.4.3 of the standard. Subclause says that products affected by failure to meet action criterion for OPRPs are required to only be released as safe when any of the conditions apply, like evidence other than the monitoring system demonstrates that the control measures have been effective. Evidence shows that the combined effect of the control measures for that particular product conforms to the performance intended, that is, identified acceptable levels, and the results of sampling, analysis, and/or other verification activities demonstrate that the affected products conform to the identified acceptable levels for the food safety hazards concerned. Lastly, this subclause states that the results of evaluation for release of products are required to be retained as documented information. Let me explain the subclause 8.9.4.3, Disposition of Non-Conforming Products. This subclause states that the products that are not acceptable for release are required to be reprocessed or further processed within or outside the organization to ensure that the food safety hazard is reduced to acceptable levels. Products are required to be redirected for other use as long as food safety in the food chain is not affected or destroyed and disposed as waste. As per this subclause 8.9.4.3 of ISO 22000-2018, the organization is required to retain documented information on the disposition of non-conforming products, including the identification of the persons with approving authority. Coming to clause 8.9.5, withdrawal or recall. This subclause 8.9.5 of ISO 22000-2018 specifies that the organization must be able to ensure the timely withdrawal or recall of lots of end products that have been identified as potentially unsafe. This must be done by appointing competent persons having the authority to initiate and carry out the withdrawal or recall. According to this subclause, the organization is required to establish and maintain documented information for notifying relevant interested parties, handling withdrawn, recalled products, as well as products still in stock, and performing the sequence of actions to be taken. The examples of interested parties include statutory and regulatory authorities, customers or consumers, etc. Subclause says that withdrawn or recalled products and end products still in stock must be secured or held under the control of the organization until they are managed in accordance with subclause 8.9.4.3 of the standard. As per this subclause 8.9.5, the organization is required to retain the cause, extent, and result of a withdrawal or recall as documented information and must be reported to the top management as input for the management review. Subclause 8.9.5 further states that the organization must verify the implementation and effectiveness of withdrawals or recalls through the use of appropriate techniques like mock withdrawal, recall or practice withdrawal, recall and retain documented information. Friends, we have discussed the Clause 8 operation of ISO 22000-2018. Now, let us discuss the Clause 9 performance evaluation of the standard. Let me begin with the Clause 9.1 monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation. The Subclause 9.1.1 general states that the organization must determine what needs to be monitored and measured, the methods for monitoring, measurement, analysis, and evaluation as applicable to ensure valid results, when the monitoring and measuring shall be performed, when the results from monitoring and measurement shall be analyzed and evaluated, and who shall analyze and evaluate the results from monitoring and measurement. Clause 9.1.1 says that the organization is required to retain appropriate documented information as evidence of the results. The organization must also evaluate the performance and the effectiveness of the FSMS. Coming to Clause 9.1.2, analysis and evaluation. This Clause 9.1.2 of ISO 22000 specifies that the organization is required to analyze and evaluate appropriate data and information arising from monitoring and measurement, including the results of verification activities related to PRPs, the hazard control plan, and the external audits. Subclause 9.1.2 states that the analysis must be carried out to confirm that the overall performance of the system meets the planned arrangements and the FSMS requirements established by the organization. According to this subclause, the analysis must be carried out to identify the need for updating or improving the FSMS and to identify trends which indicate a higher incidence of potentially unsafe products or process failures. The subclause 9.1.2 says that the organization is required to carry out the analysis to establish information for planning of the internal audit program related to the status and importance of areas to be audited. Further, the subclause 9.1.2 specifies that analysis must be carried out to provide evidence that corrections and corrective actions are effective. Subclause 9.1.2 specifies that the results of the analysis and the resulting activities must be retained as documented information. The results must be reported to top management and used as input to the management review and the updating of the food safety management system. Lastly, this standard guides and says under a note that the methods to analyze data can include statistical techniques. Let us talk about the subclause 9.2, Internal Audit. The subclause 9.2.1 Internal Audit states that the organization is required to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the food safety management system conforms to the organization's own requirements for its food safety management system and the requirements of this standard. As per this clause, the organization is required to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to provide information on whether the food safety management system is effectively implemented and maintained. Coming to subclause 9.2.2. The subclause 9.2.2 states that the organization must plan, establish, implement, and maintain audit programs, including the frequency, methods, responsibilities, planning requirements, and reporting. Internal audits must take into consideration the importance of the processes concerned, changes in the food safety management system, and the results of monitoring, measurement, and previous audits. As per this subclause, organization is required to define the audit criteria and scope for each audit, and also select competent auditors and conduct audits to ensure objectivity and the impartiality of the audit process. The subclause 9.2.2 states that an organization must ensure that the results of the audits are reported to the food safety team and relevant management. This subclause says that the organization must retain the implementation of the audit program and the audit results as documented information, as evidence, and make the necessary corrections and take the necessary corrective actions within the agreed time frame. As per this clause, the organization must determine if the food safety management system meets the intent of the food safety policy and its objectives of the food safety management system. Follow-up activities by the organization are required to include the verification of the actions taken and the reporting of the verification results. Lastly, the subclause recommends under a note to refer the ISO 19011 for guidelines for auditing management systems. Let me explain the clause 9.3, Management Review. The subclause 9.3.1 general states that the top management shall review the organization's food safety management system at planned intervals to ensure its continuing suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness. The subclause 9.3.2 Management Review input specifies that the management review must consider the following: the status of actions from previous management reviews, changes in external and internal issues that are relevant to the FSMS, including changes in the organization and its context, information on the performance and the effectiveness of the FSMS, including trends in result of system updating activities, monitoring and measurement results, analysis of the results of verification activities related to PRPs and the hazard control plan, non-conformities and corrective actions, internal and external audit results, inspections, example regulatory, customer, the performance of external providers, the review of risks and opportunities and of the effectiveness of actions taken to address them, and the extent to which objectives of the FSMS have been met, the adequacy of resources, any emergency situation, incident, or withdrawal, recall that occurred, relevant information obtained through external and internal communication, including requests and complaints from interested parties, and opportunities for continual improvement. Further, the subclause 9.3.2 states that the data must be presented in a manner that enables top management to relate the information to stated objectives of the food safety management system. Coming now to subclause 9.3.3, Management Review Output. According to this subclause 9.3.3 of ISO 22000, the outputs of the management review is required to include decisions and actions related to continual improvement opportunities. The clause says that the management review output is required to compromise any need for updates and changes to the food safety management system, including resource needs and revision of the food safety policy and objectives of the food safety management system. Lastly, covering the mandatory documentation requirements, the standard through subclause 9.3.3 specifies that the organization is required to retain documented information as evidence of the results of management reviews. Friends, we have now concluded the Clause 9 Performance Evaluation of ISO 22000-2018. Now we shall talk about the Clause 10 Improvement of the Standard. Clause 10 has three subclauses. Subclause 10.1 Non-Conformity and Corrective Action, Subclause 10.2 Continual Improvement, and Subclause 10.3 Update of the Food Safety Management System. Let me start with the Subclause 10.1. The subclause 10.1.1 states that when non-conformity occurs, the organization is required to react to the non-conformity and take actions to control and correct it, and deal with the consequences as applicable. As per the subclause 10.1.1, the organization is required to evaluate the need for action to eliminate the causes of the non-conformity in order that it does not recur or occur elsewhere by reviewing the non-conformity, determining the causes of the non-conformity, and determining if similar non-conformities exist or could potentially occur. The subclause 10.1.1 states that when non-conformity occurs, the organization is required to implement any action needed, review the effectiveness of any corrective action taken, and make changes to the food safety management system if necessary. According to this subclause, corrective actions must be appropriate to the effects of the non-conformities encountered. Now, coming to the subclause 10.1.2 of standard. The subclause 10.1.2 specifies that the organization is required to retain documented information as evidence of the nature of the non-conformities and any subsequent actions taken, and the results of any corrective action plan. Let us talk about the clause 10.2, Continual Improvement. The clause 10.2 of the standard states that the organization is required to continually improve the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the food safety management system. The top management must ensure that the organization continually improves the effectiveness of the food safety management system through the use of communication, management review, internal audit, analysis of results of verification activities, validation of control measures and combinations of control measures, corrective actions, and food safety management system updating. Friends, now coming to the last clause of this standard, that is clause 10.3, update of the food safety management system. The clause 10.3 of ISO 22000 specifies that the top management must ensure that the food safety management system is continually updated. To achieve this, the food safety team is required to evaluate the food safety management system at planned intervals. The team must consider whether it is necessary to review the hazard analysis, the established hazard control plan, and the established PRPs. According to the clause 10.3, the updating activities must be based on input from communication, external as well as internal, input from other information concerning the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the FSMS, output from the analysis of results of verification activities, and output from management review. Finally, the clause 10.3 states that the organization is required to retain system updating as documented information and report it as input to the management review. Friends, we have finished all the clauses of ISO 22000-2018 Food Safety Management System. We have reached at the end of this session. I hope that you have an idea about ISO 22000-2018 Food Safety Management System. For more information about our institute and other training programs, you can contact us through email or phone. I sincerely thank you all for your interest and attention.